Today we're sitting down with the leading alcohol expert, Professor David Nutt, to talk about why alcohol ranks as one of the most harmful drugs in society. David is a neuropharmacologist and former UK government drug advisor. David, welcome.
In your introduction, you mentioned I was a government's drug advisor. I advised the British government on drugs and drug harms and drug policy for 10 years. And during that time, I developed a scale of harms, because it just seemed to me that if you were making a decision as to whether a drug should be legal or illegal, or if it was illegal, if you were trying to make a decision as to what class it should be in, what schedule in the US it should be in, you ought to have some measure of harm. And when I joined the government, there was no sensible scale. People just put their fingers in, oh, this should be Class A, Schedule 1. And I said, this is not scientific. So essentially what we did was we developed a scale of harms. And it turns out there are 16 different ways drugs can cause harm.
You know, building on that point, you've compared alcohol to other drugs in this study that you did.
Yes.
And alcohol came out as more dangerous than a lot of them. Why do you think society gives alcohol this free pass?
Well, because most people drink. That's the first thing to say. Most people drink. People like to drink, and drink is obviously important. It is the primary social lubricant. So alcohol is basically enjoyed by people. And people generally are prepared to put up with the harms, which are extensive, because they get the benefits. Well, the problem with alcohol is it is a very small molecule, and it gets into every cell in your body, and therefore it affects all your body. So you start with your mouth and your gullet. Then if you're a heavy drinker, particularly of spirits, you have increased risk of cancer in the mouth and gullet. And then, of course, it goes into the stomach, where it damages the stomach lining, so people get ulcers and eventually get stomach cancer. And then it goes into the blood, and the blood goes through the liver, where it damages the liver, and you end up with cirrhosis. Or sometimes you don't even live long enough to get cirrhosis. You have acute hepatitis from drinking too much. And then it goes from the liver to the heart, where it poisons the heart, and you start to get what we call cardiomyopathy. The heart gets weak. And then it goes to the brain, where it starts to poison the brain, and you get intoxicated, which, of course, is what people are looking for, a bit of intoxication. But if you get very intoxicated, you get blackouts, you fall over, you get head injuries, and then you get withdrawal, which itself is toxic to the brain. So there's this progressive impact of alcohol throughout almost all the organs of the body.
And just speaking to the increase in alcohol consumption, what are the compounded damages of drinking a large amount of alcohol over time? Does that compound everything you just said, or what happens if you drink more over a long period of time?
Yes. The damage to the individual organ systems change over time. So the cancers come late, the cirrhosis comes late, the acute hepatitis comes early. It was classically seen with sailors. Sailors would come back to port after being at sea for a few months, not having drunk. And they'd go into town and they would get very, very, very drunk. And their livers would collapse and they would die because we didn't have liver transplants. So severe amount of alcohol can acutely destroy your liver. It can also kill you in other ways. In Britain, about 3, mostly young people, a week die of alcohol poisoning. In America, every major university loses at least one student. Some lose 3 or 4 students every year when they're on their 21st birthday, when they're allowed to drink. Because people get them drunk thinking it's fun, it's a celebration, and they don't realize that alcohol is a poison. It eventually will stop you breathing. And then the bigger problem of all, though, are people having accidents when they're drunk. So young people often get into fights. They drive their cars into trees. Head injury is a very common consequence of young people drinking. So those are the immediate effects. But then over time, the big killers with alcohol are cirrhosis. But an even bigger killer is actually stroke, because alcohol changes the blood flow to the brain in 2 ways. It shrinks the vessels, and it also leads to greater bleeding if you do have a bleed. So, as I said, for physical health, very hard to prove a benefit. But for mental health, social health, yes. The reason most people drink is because they enjoy it, particularly in social situations. Alcohol allows you to socialize with friends and strangers, much better than if you didn't have alcohol. That is why we serve alcohol family gatherings, weddings, funerals. People come together who you haven't seen in 30 years. You don't even remember their names, but you have a glass of wine or, you have a whiskey. You relax a bit and then you're prepared to talk to them because you don't feel so embarrassed. So the social benefits of alcohol are actually quite substantial, particularly when they're contained in environments like a bar where there's a social network as well as just the alcohol being served.
Yeah, and I mean, just recently in the U.S., the Surgeon General said that there was a crisis of loneliness.
There are people who believe there's a wonderful. He's called a paleoanthropologist. He's in Rhode Island at Providence. He's called Edward Slingerland, and he believes that alcohol made humanity. That the ability of humans to move from being hunter-gatherers, nomads, to developing static culture, towns, was because they came together to grow crops like wheat to make beer. And while the wheat, you have to have people there to protect the wheat, to stop animals eating it. And so basically people stopped moving, grew the wheat, and while the wheat was growing, they started talking to each other. They started developing things like language and writing. And stories, absolutely. Yeah. They were saying in the Netherlands, a quarter of all drinks are alcohol-free now. Why is that? Well, there are reasons of these. I think people at last believe that alcohol can be harmful. The WHO, over the last 10 years, has produced a whole series of papers, country by country by country, showing that the harms of alcohol on the different organ systems are present. So it's not possible for the industry to say that alcohol may harm some organs, it may harm the liver, but it's good for the heart. That is completely debunked. So people know that.
So for the people that are listening today, if you could ask them to rethink one thing about drugs, what would you want that to be?
You should read my book, Drugs Without the Hot Air. And the good news is, the very good news is that the third edition is now ready for printing. The first edition was 2010, I think. That lasted for 10 years. The second edition's only lasted for 5 years because the drug policies and drug laws have changed so fast. So get educated. What I would say is think all drugs are different. The really critical thing is not to say, never to think that banning a drug is going to solve a problem.